This is a tough discussion to have. You who clicked on this video inevitably have an opinion on it already. Maybe you agree with me and think that tier 10 resilience granting 40% damage resistance is too strong, or perhaps you sit on the other side of the aisle and think it's a great change to the game. Regardless, I'm optimistic and perhaps naive enough, depending on who you ask, to think that we, as adults, can have a healthy discussion about the topic through this video. To do so, I want to break down what something like 40% damage resistance as a result of tier 10 resilience does to change the state of a game like Destiny 2. How it transforms metas, shifts difficulty baselines, forces different developmental perspectives, and how it ultimately leaves the game in an unhealthy state. All from the perspective of someone who has played their fair share of Destiny 2 with almost 4,500 hours clocked. And I know with that single sentence right there, you might immediately think that I am a hardcore elitist whose goal is to try and gatekeep casual players out of completing activities. And I can solemnly swear to you that that is not the case. Just look at my YouTube videos if you don't believe me. I absolutely love making educational and informative content for casual and hardcore audiences, and I think that everyone, regardless of skill level, has a right to enjoy this game. This video is sure to be a tad controversial, and frankly lose me a ton of subscribers, so if you consider yourself to be an individual that enjoys respectful conversation and perspective sharing, even on controversial topics, I'd appreciate it if you could hit subscribe yourself to help make up for some of the damage I'm going to take with this one. And even if you disagree with me on resilience, at least we can see eye to eye on the fact that it's better to understand each other's perspectives rather than have a shouting match. So, now that you know the background and perspective from which I take my stance, why is tier 10 resilience, and subsequently 40% damage resistance, unhealthy for the game? Well, right out of the gate, it causes a huge imbalance across the three classes when it comes to the stat building department. Everyone knows that in Destiny, each of the three classes has a class ability, the cooldown of which is tied to a different stat depending on the class you play. Mobility for the Hunter class dodge, recovery for the Warlock Rift, and resilience for the Titan barricade. Depending on which class you play, you naturally want to build into your class ability synergized stat, because not only does it generally promote the playstyles that each particular class likes to run, speed for hunters, healing for warlocks, and tankiness for titans, but it also gives them one of their strongest abilities back much more quickly. The problem is that if you look at these three stats compared to each other in terms of how much value they give in general gameplay, you would rate resilience at the top of the ladder without hesitation at a 10. Give recovery a 6 or a 7, because healing is most certainly important, and if we're being honest, you would toss mobility a soggy 1, because unless your shift key is broken, absolutely no one cares about faster walking speed and base jump height. As a result, classes that naturally want to build into resilience to get their class ability back more quickly, aka Titans, also get to double dip into the fact that resilience is by far the strongest stat in the game. Meanwhile, hunters and warlocks have to try and build into mobility and resilience, or recovery and resilience respectively, just to get those same benefits of having a faster class ability cooldown and 40% damage resistance. What ends up happening is when it comes to slapping on stat increase armor mods to get up to 50 points of bonus stats using the general mod slots on your armor alone, Titans can look to buff up their discipline or their intellect, while the other two classes are pigeonholed into focusing resilience or their class ability stat. Additionally, if you didn't know, stat points in armor are allocated into two pools. Half of the stats on an armor piece are divided amongst the top half stats of your armor, mobility, resilience, and recovery, while the other half are divided out across the bottom half, discipline, intellect, and strength. Translation: it's really hard to get high stat values on two stats within the same bracket, which is a huge problem for everyone but Titans. You might think that the answer is to just buff mobility and recovery then, right? But that introduces its own set of problems, which we will touch on in a bit. Now, we have already been living with that issue to a certain degree for the majority of Destiny's lifespan before resilience got buffed the way it did. Before this change, it was the same problem with warlocks and recovery being the best stat to spec into, but you didn't really see anyone talking about it back then, and that's because even though this class stat allocation imbalance is a problem, it's certainly not one big enough to make all this fuss about. So let's talk about the main issue with resilience, and subsequently why we can't just buff everything up to match it. And please let me urge you to wait 5 minutes before writing if you don't like resilience, then just don't use it in the comments, because we're going to dismantle that argument here in just a second. The shorthand answer is that, quite frankly, It makes the game too easy. When video games are created, they are designed with a specific baseline difficulty in mind, with more complex and difficult activities pushing players to their limits and potentially being incompletable for some before you factor in a bit of practice and improvement. Ideally, you want 100% of players that play your game to be able to smack around the baseline difficulty activities without breaking a sweat. In Destiny 2, that's playlist strikes, patrols, public events, seasonal activities, and campaign missions. After that, you have a spectrum of difficulty tiers where you would place everything else in the game, such as dungeons, nightfalls, raids, and so on, which, across the entirety of the player base, you'll have about 10% of players that can complete these consistently with confidence, 40% that can knock them out with a solid bit of focus, 30% that can conquer them once in a blue moon with the dream team, and 20% that just aren't at a skill level appropriate to attempt them yet. In a perfect world, everyone is able to complete everything. There is absolutely no denying that. But the reality is that is impossible when you have such a varied array of skill levels participating in your game. It's simply not possible to make an activity both engagingly difficult and completable for both poles of the skill spectrum. The question then becomes, who has to bite the bullet? And the answer to that question lies in what consequence one of the poles of the spectrum has to face is more reasonable when the game appeals to the opposite end. In the event that the game makers appeal to the higher end players by giving them difficult content to stack up against and feel challenged by, the lower skill level players might not be able to complete it until they put in some practice and improve at the game to reach a skill level necessary to stand up to it. In the opposite reality, where Bungie appeals to the lower skill bracket of players, we live in a world where everyone can do everything, which sounds great, but the negative consequence of that is that anyone at the higher end of the skill bracket is then playing activities that are at a difficulty scaler that is as trivial to them as playlist strikes once were. In the first case, the solution was for players to practice and improve. What is the solution in the second case? Well, there isn't one. I suppose you could make the argument that higher skill level players could intentionally make their builds bad to increase the challenge, but that actually leads us into another problem. You see, when something is both meta-definingly strong and easy to achieve, like tier 10 resilience, it goes without saying that almost every single player will be incorporating that into their build. Typically, the solution for build diversity when it comes to strong builds like this is having other strong builds available that forces players to choose between one overpowered thing or another. But we already debunked why we can't just turn everything up to 11 in the previous excerpt. The game becomes too easy and therefore, quite frankly, boring. Power creep is a very real thing that we have seen many times before, and it dumpsters build diversity and build freedom like you wouldn't believe. Looking at you, Mountaintop, Recluse, and Anarchy. So, if it can be assumed that everyone is rocking tier 10 resilience and therefore 40% damage resistance, Bungie must design future content in one of two ways. Methodology number one is to design content neglectful of the fact that most players will be utilizing tier 10 resilience, in which case it feels incredibly enjoyable, engaging, and potentially challenging for any player without tier 10 resilience, but extremely easy for any player who does have tier 10 resilience. So much so to the point where they couldn't die even if they tried, which doesn't sound particularly engaging. People play video games for different reasons, of course, and it's always great to have that laid-back difficulty content. But when that element of ease starts to sneak itself into those endgame difficulties of content, you lose that engaging aspect that encourages you to be creative with your builds, coordinate with your team, and practice your skills. And for a lot of players, that is where the fun in Destiny comes from. People who tell higher skill players to intentionally use bad builds to make the game difficult and therefore engaging for themselves are missing the point that part of the fun in Destiny is finding that perfect loadout, that perfect stat line, that perfect setup, and that perfect execution. But when all content crumbles with closed eyes when met with a strong build, players feel like their practice and skill doesn't actually mean anything. Methodology number two is the reverse of this, where Bungie designs content around the fact that most players are running tier 10 resilience, which means if you are running tier 10 resilience, then cool, the difficulty feels on par. But if you aren't rocking tier 10 resilience, then the game will be unreasonably hard, which some might say, well, Wait a minute, didn't you say you wanted content to be hard? And yes, I did, but as a result of being pushed to my limits and forced to put my skills, game knowledge, and build crafting to the test. Not because I shot myself in the foot by using bad gear just to feel something. Now, if you're a lower skilled player on the other end of the skill level spectrum, this design methodology negatively impacts you as well by effectively stifling your build diversity freedoms entirely. If the difficulty of the game is designed around the idea that all players will have tier 10 resilience, then you are effectively forced into building it. Otherwise, the game will be too difficult for you. You can't build into mobility for faster dodges or recovery for quicker regen, because the enemies that have had their damage values set around the idea that everyone has 40% damage resistance will just one-shot you who is just trying to use something else that looked fun. And if all that wasn't bad enough, tier 10 resilience obliterates the difficulty of the game moving backwards, considering that the bulk of the game was designed using methodology number 1 and balanced before resilience was this strong. Enemy damage values and mob density were created and adjusted with the idea that no one would have any damage resistance aside from circumstantial situations like specific mod builds or exotic armor pieces. But now everyone is negating almost half of all damage at all times uncircumstantially. Believe me, I completely understand that you might think that I just want the game to be more difficult because I hate casual players that crutch resilience and don't want them to complete endgame activities. But I assure you that is not the case at all. I want the game to be more difficult because it gives us something to strive for, something to triumph over with our teammates on game night, something to encourage us to find the most fun and diverse builds and put them to the test. But at the end of the day, my opinions and perspectives are just one of many, and although you might not agree with it, the fact that you made it this far in the video means you at least have the intellectual maturity to listen to other perspectives and think critically about both them and your own. And for that, I have the utmost respect for you. When it really comes down to it, it's just a video game where we shoot aliens with our friends. Personally, I feel the current state of resilience is unhealthy in that game, but whether it gets changed or not, I'll still make helpful and educational content for casual and hardcore audiences alike. Because if there is one thing that I emphatically believe, it's that everyone should be able to enjoy this game. And that's something I think we can all get behind. Make sure to like and subscribe if you agree, and let me know your thoughts on resilience in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.